In this video I'd like to talk about the men, and in some cases the women, behind the etudes. Now this might be a typical trajectory for a violin student through the etudes. Kayser, Mazas, Kreutzer, Fiorillo, Rode, Gaviniès, Dont, and then the performance ones, Paganini and Bach. Of course there are many others such as Allard, Sevcik, Schradiek, Dankler and Wieniawski and Ernst studies. Perhaps you could let me know in the comments which violin etudes you swear by and recommend for a beginner to advanced, to see the violinist through the journey of technique in order for the violinist to end up with the full technique. Now Kreutzer, of course, they were the studies that Heifetz swore by, and you can see those in the old black and white videos of his masterclasses in California.
Right, I would like you to do a few Kreutzers. Number 24. Do you have your Kreutzer here? Yes. Open it to 24. Now it says Allegro, right? Yes. We will not play it Allegro. Slow. Pam, pa, 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 pam. Play Robo. 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 Now in the front. Extreme. That way, so you'll be using your bow.
Getting his students amongst virtuoso pieces such as Chausson Poème and Bach and Tchaikovsky Concerto, he's also asking his students to play Kreutzer etudes, to home in on particular areas of technique that need brushing up. In terms of the absolute beginner studies, we might give a shout out to ÉTUDES, who has produced a number of books that are excellent for children to begin the violin. And arguably the most difficult, perhaps those would be the studies by Ernst. Note that some of them have several books which can span through several levels, such as Sevcik and Dankler. In this video, let's have a look at the men behind some of the etudes. I'm going to focus on some of the ones that I particularly studied, and we won't talk about Bach and Paganini because those are well known, but instead we're going to home in on some of the other etudes and find out a little more about the men who composed these fine etudes. It's interesting that Oskar Szumski actually recorded the Rode etudes, and I think that must be because he owned the Rode Stradivarius. I suspect that's one of the reasons. More specifically, the Rode Duke of Cambridge violin of 1715, not the decorated Rode that is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So then, who was Heinrich Ernst Kayser? He's the first guy that we'll look at. Unfortunately, I can't find that much information about him, but the little bit of information I could find about him is this. He was a German violinist, a violist, composer and violin pedagogue, born on the 16th of April 1850 in Altona, Hamburg, and died on the 17th of January 1888 in Hamburg. Kayser is remembered mainly for his elementary and progressive studies for the violin Opus 20. But here's a list of some of his published works. I went through this book many moons ago, but one of my personal favourites of his etudes is the number 6, which kind of sounds a little bit gypsy-like. So having completed your Kayser studies, you might next move on to your Mazas studies. So who was Jacques Fiorillo Mazas? Born in Lavaux, Mazas was a pupil of Pierre Baillot at the Paris Conservatoire, from which he received the first prize in 1805. In 1808 he played a violin concerto dedicated to him by Albert. He then performed widely across Europe. In 1831 he accepted the post of first violin at the Théâtre du Palais Royal. Short time later he was appointed Directeur des Concerts in Orléans, where he directed that city's Opéra Comique Theatre. From 1837 to 1841, he was director of the Conservatoire in Cambrai. He died in Bordeaux. And here's a list of some of his selected works. Now that you've conquered your Mazas etudes, it's time to take your violin playing to the next level and tackle the Kreutzer etudes.
Slow.
The ones that Maestro Jascha Heifetz swore by.
More bow.
Heavy metal guitar virtuoso Eddie Van Halen draws on the Kreutzer Etude No. 2 in his famous track Eruption. So who was Rudolf Kreutzer then? He was born on the 15th of November 1766 and died on the 6th of January 1831. He was a French violinist, teacher, conductor and composer of 40 French operas, including La Mort d'Abel in 1810. He was born in Versailles, was initially taught by his German father, who was a musician at the Royal Chapel, with later lessons from Anton Stamitz. He became one of the foremost violin virtuosos of his day, appearing as a soloist until 1810. He embedded with the army of Italy under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1797, charged with copying Italian musical manuscripts and returning them to France as trophies. He was a violin professor at the Conservatoire de Paris from its foundation in 1795 until 1826. He was co-author of the Conservatoire's violin method with Pierre Rodet and Pierre Baillot, and the three are considered the founding trinity of the French school of violin playing. For a time, Kreutzer was leader of the Paris Opera, and from 1817 he conducted there too. He died in Geneva and is buried in Paris at the Père Lachaise cemetery. Kreutzer was well known for his style of bowing, his splendid tone and the clearness of his execution. His compositions include 19 violin concertos. His best known works, however, are the 42 etudes or caprices, which are fundamental pedagogic studies and were composed in 1796. He's probably best known as the dedicatee of Beethoven's Violin Sonata No. 9, Opus 47, from 1803, known as the Kreutzer Sonata, though he never played the work. Kreutzer made the acquaintance of Beethoven in 1798 when at Vienna in the service of the French ambassador Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, later King of Sweden and Norway. Beethoven originally dedicated the sonata to George Bridgetower, the violinist, at its first performance, but after a quarrel he revised the dedication in favour of Kreutzer. Now that you've cracked the Kreutzer etudes, time to move on to the Fiorillo etudes. There's a great etude in here, number 3, for staccato work. So who was Federico Fiorillo? Federico Fiorillo was born in Brunswick, Germany, around 1755 and died sometime after 1823. He was a mandolinist and composer who wrote 36 caprices for violin, also called ÉTUDES. His father was a Neapolitan who also played mandolin. At the beginning of the 18th century, his father was appointed conductor at the court opera house at Brunswick and settled there, where his son Federico was born. Federico's early musical education was superintended by his father. He inherited his parents' love of the mandolin and obtained complete mastery over it, able to show mastery of delicate nuances of tone of which it was capable. He also moved on to violin and viola. In 1780 he travelled to Poland, and in 1783 he was conductor of the band at Riga for 2 years. 2 years later he was playing the violin with success at the Concert Spirituel in Paris. While in Paris he published some of his first compositions, which were well received. In 1788 he made a visit to London, where he played the viola in Salomon's quartet. He made his last public appearance in London in 1794, where he performed a concerto for the viola at the Antient concert. After leaving London, he went to Amsterdam and from there to Paris in 1823. Here's a list of his compositions. Music historian Philip J. Bone felt that the 36 caprices for the violin rank equally with the classical studies of Kreutzer and Rode, and apart from their usefulness are not without merit as compositions. They have been edited by innumerable violinists of repute, and Louis Spohr wrote and published an accompanying violin part to them. Fiorillo's other compositions include concertos, duos, trios, quartets, and quintets for stringed instruments. Next, we move on to the Rode etudes. Here's where I personally am starting to hit the limit as an amateur violinist of my technique, but I have tackled a couple of the Rode etudes successfully. But now the technique is really getting pushed upwards. Pierre Rode. His was an interesting and somewhat sad life in the end. Jacques-Pierre Joseph Rode, born on the 16th of February 1774 and died on the 25th of November 1830, was a French violinist and composer. Born in Bordeaux, Aquitaine, France, Pierre Rode travelled in 1787 to Paris and soon became a favourite pupil of the great Giovanni Battista Viotti, who found the boy so talented that he charged him no fee for the lessons. Rode inherited his teacher's style, to which he added more mildness and a more refined tone of his own. It is also recorded that he made extensive use of portamento. He collaborated with Bayeux and Kreutzer on the official violin method of the Conservatoire de Paris, published in 1802. Rode served as violin soloist to Napoleon and toured it extensively in the Netherlands, Germany, England and Spain, staying with François-Adrien Boieldieu in St. Petersburg from 1804 until 1809, and later spending much time in Moscow. When he returned to Paris, he found that the public no longer responded with much enthusiasm to his playing. Spohr, who had heard him before and after his Russian sojourn, wrote that Rode's playing had become cold and full of mannerism. But according to some sources, he suffered from a lymphatic infection caused by Streptococcus bacteria that affected his right arm, reducing his ability to bow with any force or rapidity. Ludwig van Beethoven wrote his last violin sonata, opus 96, for Rode when the violinist was visiting Vienna. Rode also performed chamber music, but the backbone of his repertoire was formed by Viotti's concertos, which served as models for his own concertos. These, as well as his 24 caprices, or etudes, in all the major and minor keys, were written from 1814 to 1819 when he lived in Berlin. In 1828, Rode made a last attempt at a public concert in Paris. It was such a fiasco that it was widely believed that it hastened his death on the 25th of November 1830 at Château de Bourbon near Damazon, Lot-et-Garonne, in his native Aquitaine. In all, Pierre Rode composed 13 violin concertos and many other works for violin, including at least 4 quatuors bouillants for violin and string trio. Although his violin concertos have some significance in the development of the Romantic concerto, they are nowadays rarely performed. His major enduring contribution to the literature are his 24 caprices, which are a standard part of the repertoire for advanced study of the violin. He also had a major influence on younger violinists such as Louis Spohr, who adopted his style and developed it further. Next up, Gaviniès. Pierre Gaviniès was born on the 11th of May 1728 and died on the 8th of September 1800. He was a French violinist, pedagogue and composer. Gaviniès was born in Bordeaux as the son of a luthier and taken to Paris by his father in 1734. At age 13, he made his debut at the Concert Spirituel in Les Tuileries, playing a Jean-Marie Leclerc sonata for 2 violins. Sometime around 1753, he received a prison sentence as a result of an affair with a countess. Bit of a scandal there. In 1762, he reached the peak of his career. Giovanni Battista Viotti described him as the French Tartini, a singular compliment. Jean Godefroy Eckart, Le Duc l'Aîné, Rodolphe Kreutzer and Romain de Brasseur dedicated works to him. The cellist Martin Berthaud named a sonata La Gaviniès. His seminal work is the 24 Matinées, published in 1794, a combination of violin studies that includes extremely complex passages with the main goal of developing bowing facility. Here's a list of his works. And now on to Dont. Jacob Dont was born on March the 2nd, 1815 and died on November the 17th, 1888. He was an Austrian violinist, composer and teacher. He was born and died in Vienna. His father, Valentin Dont, was a noted cellist. Jacob was a student of Joseph Böhm and of Georg Helmersberger. At the age of 16, he became a member of the Hofburg Theater Orchestra and in 1834 entered service at the Vienna. During this time, Dont appeared frequently as a soloist. Despite his success, he decided against a career as a soloist, and in 1853 became a professor at the Pädagogisches Institut in Vienna. From 1871, Dont was employed at the Wiener Conservatorium. He would eventually leave this post as the use of his own instructional compositions was forbidden. Dont's compositions are mainly limited to innovative teaching material. His 24 Etudes and Caprices, Gradus ad Parnassum, Opus 34, and the 24 exercises preparatory to the studies of R. Kreutzer and P. Rode, Opus 37, are considered some of the most important technical studies of the violin. So here's Etudes and Caprices. We're talking about advanced level violin technique, which comes just before progressing on to the Bach sonatas and partitas and Paganini's Caprices. I once heard that the 4-year-old Jascha Heifetz was already able to tackle a Dont etude. I haven't had that confirmed, so I'm not sure, but I wouldn't put it past Heifetz. Here's a list of some of the compositions of Dont. Now at last the violin student will be prepared to tackle the Paganini and Bach and go on to become a Jedi Knight of the violin. I've taught myself some of the Bach. If I'm honest, I'm never going to be able to perform the chaconne or play it at performance speed. And I've also tackled a couple of the Paganini caprices, notably the number 5. I didn't really try and do the original bowing that Ricci does, or I have tried playing it slowly, but it's very hard. And Caprice number 20 as well. My teacher wanted to challenge and push me a bit, but as an amateur violinist at the age of 48 now, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to play the Caprice number 24 at performance speed. But I'm happy that I can manage the number 20. But I've got some other etudes that I want to talk about as well. Allard, Sevcik, Wieniawski, Ernst, Dankler. So I'll perhaps make those a subject of a part 2. Ciao for now.